Please give it up for the incomparable Dr. Gail.
Well, first let me say thank you for that introduction. I don't know about you, but I get the willies when people say things like incomparable. It makes me nervous, but I thank you very much for that. I've had a chance to experience one session with this group, and I have just been so impressed with your sincerity, your authenticity, your commitment. And you know, the philanthropic world is a pretty big world, a world of privilege. And I have to honestly say, I did not know about SVP when I was with the Kellogg Foundation. So it's been a learning for me, and I feel honored and privileged to have been invited to be a keynote for this very important international conference. For those of you who are from Cleveland, let me share a little story. When I grew up in Cleveland, there was a newspaper called the Cleveland Press. I don't know if it still exists or not. It was Scripps Howard. And they used to give students season's tickets to the baseball games if you got straight A's. So I'm bragging a little, but it's also a joke. So I had season tickets for the Cleveland Indians baseball team for 4 consecutive years. And I went to every game. And Cleveland lost every game. So, you can imagine my excitement when there was finally a championship for Cleveland not too long ago. So what I want to talk about is the journey a little bit of my own career journey, but more of the journey within the Kellogg Foundation to have the courage to eventually launch a truth and reconciliation effort for America. Now that was quite a journey. The Kellogg Foundation started its work, and I want to make sure I'm being heard in the back. If there's any problem, let me know, okay? But the Kellogg Foundation started this work of equity, diversity, inclusion at least 35 years ago. And it took them a long time to finally call the question of the issue of racism. And I want to be clear, not race, racism. And there is an important difference in understanding, because ultimately racism is a belief system. It's an ideology. It's a way of seeing the world. And it is the legacy of that belief system that we live with. And so when people say we need conversations about race, or we need another dialogue on race, I always say, no, we don't. Because those tend to be circular. And we tend to take sides. And we tend to get hurt and confused and angry. But if we can come to grips with the fact that the antiquated 16th and maybe even 15th century concept of a hierarchy of human value, and this taxonomy hails from way back. It preceded Linnaeus, but Linnaeus was a botanist in the 1700s who created taxonomies that we live with today in biology. But he also created a taxonomy of the human family. And some of his contemporaries ascribed personality and psychological characteristics to this taxonomy. And that's what gave us the notion of white supremacy or white superiority. Now, we have, and I'm a Star Trek fan, so I use this phrase, we have jettisoned many ancient concepts. We no longer think that the world is flat, right? There are many things. I grew up and we were taught that there were 9 planets in the solar system. How many are there? We don't even know. We can't count them all. So there are concepts that we can jettison, that we can leave behind. And the fallacy of a hierarchy of human value and worth must be left behind. Now, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, 6 million, 7 million, 8 million, 9 million, 10 million, 11 million, 12 million, 13 million, 14 million, 15 million, 16 million, 17 million, 18 million, 19 million, 20 million, 21 million, 22 million, 23 million, 24 million, 25 million, 26 million, 27 million, 28 million, 29 million, 30 million, 31 million, 32 million, 33 million, 34 million, 35 million, 36 million, 37 million, 38 million, 39 million, 40 million, 41 million, 42 million, 43 million, 44 million, 45 million, 46 million, 47 million, 48 million, 49 million, 50 million, 51 million, 52 million, 53 million, 54 million, 55 million, 56 million, 57 million, 58 million, 59 million, 60 million, 61 million, 62 million, 63 million, 64 about changing hearts and minds. It's about figuring out how do we do that? How do we take a belief system that has wound its way into all of our institutions? It's the belief system upon which the United States was built. And that's a hard one, right? I recommend to you a wonderful book called The Counter-Revolution of 1776. And in it, the author uses primary documents to teach about how there was another revolution going on and how people resisted the notion of a hierarchy of human value. And that's affirming for me as a woman of color to read about the way my ancestors stood up and fought back and resisted. But it's also affirming to understand that there's always been division and complexity, and we have to figure out our way through it. So if you're in the business of changing hearts and minds, there's some people out there who are pretty good at this. And I want to say anybody who represents the IT field, there is a place for you in this work, a very special place. The founder of Facebook says that they underestimated how this idea of connecting people could be used for bad, not for good. We need to take that moment and push forward a way of using that industry for good, for using information technology to help us jettison the belief in a hierarchy of human value. So if anybody here speaks to that audience, please talk to me afterwards. But we were guided at the Kellogg Foundation by the work of Howard Gardner. And Howard gave us the concepts of multiple intelligences. Some of you may be familiar with that. He has a wonderful book called The Art and Science of Changing Hearts and Minds. And so I'm going to quickly go through his key points of how you do this, right? His first one is reason. We know that doesn't always work, right? I live in the DC area, trust me. His second point is research. And yes, you can use the data, you can use research to convince people to see things differently. But the problem with that is they're often counter forces. If you remember the struggle to identify cigarettes as harmful, the tobacco industry used research to counter that. We have a lot of that happening today. His third point is called redescription. And I want you to remember that point because that is really critical to being effective in this work. And it's why you have to have an expanded circle of engagement. Now, a lot of people use the term inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of the Native American members of our work have taught us that the concept of inclusion actually reflects the hierarchy that we're trying to get rid of. And so instead of saying inclusion, we say expanding the circle of engagement. Because if I say inclusion, I'm saying it's mine and I decide to include you in it. So just think about that. But when you engage multiple perspectives in this work, you move to redescription because we've all been affected by this absurd notion of a hierarchy of human value. And I'll talk specifically about a racial healing methodology. Gardner's other point is resonance. And he says hearts and minds. If you're really going to move people, you have to touch the heart. And that's resonance. And there's nothing more powerful that I know of than story to help us do that. And we've developed a methodology over the years that facilitates and engages people in sharing stories in ways that transforms their perception of the other. We live in a very segregated society. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to read the book, The Color of Law, which documents how segregated housing was probably the most effective public policy strategy this country's ever had. We are segregated today by intention, by policies at the federal and state and local and county levels. Why is that? Because we believe in racial hierarchy. And if you believe in racial hierarchy, the group shall never live near each other. But if you're doing the work, now we've talked about reason, research, redescription, resonance. The other piece in Gardner's framework is resistance. If you're going to do this work well, there will be resistance. I tell young people today who feel upset with the election outcome and say, and I'm not going to be partisan here, although my bias may come through, but there are many young people who are concerned about what's happening, and they say, we are the resistance. And I say to them, no, what you saw happen is the resistance. It is the resistance to this movement, this wave of embracing diversity. Now, there is solid research that has shown that the motivation that led to the election outcome had more to do with fear of diversity. And that was before things were revealed about Cambridge Analytica and their strategy to do that. So what we are experiencing now in terms of this fomenting of division in our society is really the resistance to what appeared to be forward movement in terms of this equity and diversity effort. Part of it is that. There are other parts, but actually surveying voting populations, it's pretty, Stanford really did this research, Stanford University, that it really had a lot to do with fear of diversity. Once you get, but you have to understand resistance is there, so as you do your work in your organizations, don't be stopped by resistance. Don't be afraid of resistance. Engage. Because it's natural to resist the unknown. But then it's about resources and rewards. Now, when the Kellogg Foundation Board of Directors made the bold and courageous statement that they were going to become the most effective anti-racist organization they could be, it was about that time that they needed a vice president, and they interviewed and hired me. My goal was to get there and be asked to lead that work, although I was hired for health, to lead the health work. But you see, these are life and death issues. I come at this equity work understanding the burden that people bear who experience discrimination on a daily basis. And that burden and that adversity, be it overt one-on-one discrimination or living in under-resourced communities, or living with the fear of deportation, or living with the fear and the effects of colonization, that burden translates into biological stress and trauma. And that stress is a strong determinant of health and well-being, both the immune system and vulnerability to chronic diseases like hypertension and diabetes. So the reason I think we have to do this work, the imperative for me, has to do with improving the health of our country. Now, it just so happens that given the aging population and the escalating costs of health care, the health of our country is also the economic viability of our country. Because if we keep spending at the rate that we're spending on health care costs, guess what? We won't have anything left to spend on anything else. We have to become a healthier nation. So the Kellogg Foundation said, we're going to do this work. They weren't going to do diversity work. They weren't going to do inclusion. They weren't going to do capitalizing on diversity. They weren't going to do multicultural, because they had done all that. They said bravely, we're going to tackle racism. But my particular methodology for change says you have to focus on what you want, not what you don't want. You have to focus on what you're for, not what you are against. And so the board said, we want to be anti-racist. I said, well, wait a minute. How about talking about what you wanted to be for, not against? So we modified that, and so they changed that board document, and once it's written, they changed it to, we want to be the most effective anti-racist organization that promotes racial equity. Then we were in business. What were we doing? What were we going to promote? So we did a lot of work, we researched and all of that, and we came up with a plan. We asked the board for $100 million, which at that time was the largest single, we called them blankets at the time. And they said, well, that's a little much, So they said, we'll give you $75 million. But they took the other 25 and put it in Brazil. And that's an interesting story in terms of the issues of racism in Brazil and racial hierarchy, which of course they have no problems with, right? So we built on the work of the Clinton Commission on Race, which never saw the light of day, but they had done a lot of research and a lot of organizing, and we decided we needed to create a national community of practice of people who were doing this work. And over 10 years, we worked with that community. We learned a lot of lessons. Those lessons are embodied in the framework for the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation work. But one of the most important lessons, and I really want to leave this with you today, is the important insight into racial healing work. Why do we say racial healing? We don't say anti-racism. We don't say race relations. We don't say racial conversations. We say racial healing. How many of you know that yesterday was a monumental day on our journey of racial healing, when a memorial was created, a museum was opened, acknowledging the decades of lynching in this country? If you go to visit that memorial, if you look at those pictures, if you hear those stories, you'll understand what we mean by healing. Because what we had in this country for many, many decades was what I call organized lovelessness. Because racial hatred is really the inability to love, to extend compassion. It's a mental justification that says that other person doesn't deserve to be embraced in the fullness of their humanity. That somehow I'm disconnected from them. And it's an anathema. It is not who we are as a human family. When the truth is told, people talk about descendants from Africa. Hello. We're all descendants from Africa. We are one human family. And our ancestors adapted to the climates in which they evolved. And whether you have dark skin or light skin, straight hair or curly hair, thin nose or broad nose, it's a reflection of the brilliance embedded in the human body's ability to adapt, to meet its needs. And this nonsense of saying that you do or do not deserve to be treated as a human being based on that, I mean, when you think about it, there's probably nothing more absurd. And yet we continue to do it. Now, the racial healing methodology that we designed and use is a process of gathering people together in a circle who are all very different. The work is really done ahead of time. So you'll be in a circle with people who are Native American, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, African American, white, Appalachian, regionally different. And you all have the ability to do that because you represent the world, essentially, and all over the country. But you deliberately come together, and there are prompts that are given, and you share stories, and it's a facilitated process. If you do that for 5 hours, and you listen, one of the prompts we use is ask people to tell a story about a time when their humanity was affirmed. Now, we've had some white men get that question, and they look puzzled, and they say, what? My humanity is always affirmed, right? And so they have to modify it. But if you take people of color who live with a daily assault on their humanity, often, but you ask them to talk about a time when it was affirmed, the stories that come out are profound. And when you hear the story of a Native American, an Alaska Native, and Pacific Islander, and Asian American, and immigrants, and refugee families, and African American, it's amazing. Because what you hear is the common humanity in all of these stories. And it's healing in the sense that we get rid of the oppression Olympics. How many of you have experienced the oppression Olympics, you know? And that's a part of the focus of the healing work. It's on our common humanity. And when you can have, and this was one of the things that came out of the work, I remember there was a shooting at a Sikh temple. Some of you may remember that. When you had African American and Native American and all these other groups stand up in support of this community and said, if you attack their church, you attack our church. That's when we knew we'd turned a corner, because we found our common bond as communities. So that's what we mean by racial healing. Now, very quickly, let me give you the components of the TRHT. It has a 5-part framework. And the first part is narrative change. We have to tell a different story about America. The fact that it's taken almost 400 years to acknowledge publicly the more than 4,000 lynchings that happened in this country, we've been in denial about the true narrative of America. If we come together to face that history and reconcile with it and say we're moving forward collectively, that'll be tremendously powerful and healing for all of us. But we have to have new narratives. And we can accelerate the pace at which those narratives are internalized, I believe, by using social media for good. The second part of the framework is this work I just described, the racial healing and the relationship building. Progress in America, success in America is all about relationships. You know that. Who do you know? Who can open a door for you? Who validates who you are? I became a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, and it was because someone white nominated me and campaigned for my election. It never would have happened if he hadn't done that. So this idea of building relationships is fundamental, and the healing circles help that process. There are many other things. But then we have to, after we do the narrative work and the racial healing work, we have to ask ourselves, how is it that this absurd notion of a hierarchy of human value has become embedded and sustained for 4 centuries? How did we do that? We did it through 3 primary means, and these are the buckets. That's a nice scientific term for the framework. We did it through separation. If we can keep people separate, we can hold on to our biases. Now, right now, the idea of unconscious bias is a real popular thing. How many of you are doing bias, unconscious bias, or anti-bias training? A lot of organizations are, and that is important work. To be biased is not to be racist. To be biased is to be human. The brain needs to categorize. The brain needs to categorize. I see this chair, and I don't have to look at that chair and say, it's got a front and a back and 4 legs. It's a chair, right? I automatically know it's a chair. We've received so much information over the years that supports this racial hierarchy that we automatically respond with bias. And so building systems to help mitigate that automatic response with bias is part of the work. Connecting, but the research tells us being with the perceived other does more to reduce our biases than all the books we could read in the world. If I develop a relationship with someone who is other, if I'm invited into their home, I'm going to have to just peel away my biases. Separation is a big piece. The other is the law. The notion of racial hierarchy is embedded in our legal system, not just the criminal justice system, which you hear about. It's embedded in our civil, in our constitutions, in our state laws. I believe it's the state of Oregon that was originally created to be a white state, right? And you have this all over America. But the final piece was the economy. Make no mistake about it, our economy was built on the notion of a hierarchy of human value. It continues to function in that way. There's a book I recommend that you read. It's called Hitler's American Model. In it, the author goes back and reviews the original Nuremberg papers to show that Nazi Germany was modeled after American racism and American laws. So we exported this. We pulled together over 150 organizations whose collective reach is 200 million people in America, and we engaged them in a collaborative design process to come up with action steps related to each one of these 5 elements of the framework. And communities all over this country are now doing this work. One of our most vital partners is the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and they received funding from some other folks, and they created an RFP, and they had, I think, at least 500 responses. They've given grants to 10 colleges and universities to set up truth, racial healing, and transformation centers on their campuses. The Kellogg Foundation, in partnership with local community foundations, funded 15 communities around the country. But the work is just beginning, and I certainly invite you to connect. We're working in Los Angeles, we're working in Chicago, we're working in Buffalo, New York. I don't think we have one in Cleveland, but that could be fixed. But we would love to see this work happening all over the country. It's a work that is focused on bringing us together. We don't say reconciliation, we say transformation. Why don't we say reconciliation? Because the over 40 truth and reconciliation efforts that have happened in the world are about bringing countries, with the exception of a few, are about bringing countries back together after a conflict. America was never together. And that's why we must be transformed. Our statements about equity, our statements about the equality and rights to that, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those are aspirational statements. But in order to get to that place of actualizing the potential of those aspirations, we got to clean this up. We got to do this work. We have really nothing to lose, and we have everything to gain. Because today, not 10 years from today, not 5 years from today, today, most of the children in America are children of color. And most of those children are growing up in low income and impoverished conditions. Do the math. If we let most of our people not be prepared to contribute to our democracy, are we going to have a democracy? So I would suggest to you that the work is urgent. There's an imperative for us to do the work. It is happening around the country. There are many people in philanthropy really moving forward in this work, but there's a way to do it that is engaging and inviting and affirming for all of us. Some of you may have seen this thing that happened on, I believe it was CNN, where this caller called in to a panelist and said, "Hi, I'm Gary, and I'm a racist." Did anybody remember seeing that? And the panelist listened, and she prepared herself, to be attacked, but she wasn't. He was an honest person. He said, "Look, this is what I think. This is how I feel." And she responded from a place of love and compassion. She acknowledged his courage in doing this on television. She thanked him for being honest, and then she proceeded to give him recommendations for what he could do. That thing went viral, and within a week it had millions of views. Gary reached out to the person that was on the panel. That person happened to be my daughter. And I was so proud of her because she embodied love and compassion in a critical moment. And that moment changed Gary's life, and it actually, in many ways, changed her life. So I'm happy to have been invited to share with you. I hope some of the thoughts I've left you with trigger questions and the desire to act. And we are more than happy to be helpful as you move forward in your journey. But know that, as I know in my heart, we can do this. And we must do it together as one nation. Thank you very much.
I told you all, she incomparable. We are going to take a couple of questions. I'm going to run around a mic. I think Kathy, you can, here. All the logistics.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. So we're going to run a couple of mics. Take a quick question. I just asked for the sake of time, ask a question. Who's up first? Hands. Oh, yes, go ahead.
This is an international network. As you know, it's in Social Venture Partners International. And can you speak to any examples where you're seeing this hierarchy of human value in an international context and some solutions that Kellogg Foundation might be supporting that might relate to our non-US people in the room?
And I'm going to give you a few examples. First of all, I believe the animus that is now palpable toward refugees and the fact that it's being leveraged to foment far-right responses, underneath that is this belief in a hierarchy of human value. Now, some of it is religious, but much of it is also the racial hierarchy concept. And the fear is being really stoked in that sense. There is no question internationally that the same forces that fomented racial fear in this country, it is an international network. And if you follow the details of the alt-right and others, they are working internationally to do this. This is definitely happening. I mentioned that the Kellogg Foundation put $25 million in Brazil earlier to help Brazil come to an honest reckoning on its legacy of racial hierarchy. Brazil was unique in, and many of the countries around Brazil were unique in denying racism. But those people of color, darker complexion who live there, they describe their countries as pigmentocracies. And there is a book by that same title, Pigmentocracies, that helps to reveal how this absurd notion has been the basis of governance all over the world. How you deal with it, the fundamental principles don't change. It's resources, it's relationships, it's moving out of denial and coming into the realization that this work needs to be done. So that would be a short answer to the question. I think that it is a global problem. The United Nations recently issued a public statement, a declaration, if you will, that the US needs to deal with reparations. But we know that you're not going to get to that until you get to the heart change that needs to occur. So this is a global problem. There's no question about that. And as I said when I talked about Hitler's American model, we exported this. Our laws, our systems, we actually exported them, and they have cost this world a great deal. But thank you for that question, for sure. Yep. We have time for one more?
Two. Another question? We have time for two more questions. Don't be shy. She just blew you away, huh?
Oh, no. Yes, there we go.
You just mentioned reparations, and that's a common question that comes up, particularly with people who are not familiar with equity work, particularly. How does that fit into your overall racial healing perspective?
So if you go online and you download from the Kellogg Foundation the implementation guide, and if you request a copy of the recommendation report from the design teams, they actually put the word reparations in their report, right? The economy team. Now, the economy team, of course, when our lawyers looked at that, they said, whoa, wait a minute. So we had to say, these recommendations are from the team. They're not Kellogg Foundation recommendations, you know. But clearly, my response to that is that once you've had the transformation, once you've changed the hearts, it's natural. The natural next step is to figure out collectively how to undo and fix. And as long as reparations are demanded, it's muddy and it's cloudy. But when we get to the point where it's an outgrowth of the work, now, there have been cases where reparations were given. We know that. The Japanese internment and other situations. But I just think the depth of the 400 years of adherence to this ideology, we have to do the work that precedes it in order to get to that and to get to a solution that makes sense economically. Last question.
I will preface it to say that regardless of your answer, I believe we need to continue to do the work. But do you believe transformation is possible for the United States?
I recommend that, and thank you for that question. I recommend that everyone read Madeleine Albright's new book. I think the title is Fascism, a Warning. And she uses her vast experience as a former Secretary of State to walk us through changes that occurred in countries, in governments, in leaders, through a window, a lens that none of us would have, right? And I'm an optimist, so I always believe that it's possible, right? I mean, look at where we've come in terms of so much that has happened that is good, right? And I believe in democracy as a form of government. I believe it works. And so I know that people's consciousness can be changed, and we can come together and exercise our collective power as a voting public, and we can transform this country. It is my belief, though, that we've only dealt with the symptoms. We have never dealt with the underlying belief. So I happen to have a philosophy of life that says my consciousness, what I believe, what I focus on, what I draw into my world from my thoughts has power. And that's why if we do the work of getting rid of the fundamental belief, the fundamental consciousness that doesn't embrace our full humanity, the transformation will be ushered in. Now, I left the foundation because I realized you can't simply take away a belief. We need something else to believe, right? And that's the work that I'm doing now through the Ntianu Center, which is named in honor of my firstborn child that died in infancy. But I believe if people understand the gift of human life and develop reverence and respect for their own lives within their own bodies, then they extend that to others. And so at the same time that we have to undo and jettison the false belief, we have to replace it with a new reverence and respect for all life and understand the sacred interconnected nature of life. And when we do that work, that fundamental work, we'll shift the consciousness of America, and when the consciousness shifts, so will America. It will be transformed. So thank you for that.
Thank you.